Hello, this is an interview for Cast in Stone. I am Dr. Nathaniel Tobias Coleman, and I'm joined by, would you please introduce yourself and tell me your profession and any association that you have that is relevant to our interview?
My name is Silu Pascoe. I'm a retired social worker, and my interest is the fact that I have a lifelong interest in history, but especially the hidden stories or the overlooked stories, and not having done anything at school regarding the transatlantic slave trade from a enslaved Africans point of view, that's been my particular interest. That was before I even knew I had a more personal involvement in this area, which I only found out about in 2008. My father was Ghanaian, and I found out more about the family history in 2008, in that we have in the family Dutch ancestors who, well, the one directly related as an ancestor was the Director General of Elmina slave fort.
Wow.
So you can imagine, I've always been interested in this area, but I didn't know it has such a personal family connection.
Please tell me how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. What brought it to your attention?
In 1999, I came to what was the launch of a respectable trade exhibition here in Bristol. At that time, I was living and working in Cornwall. So I came to this exhibition knowing something about Bristol's involvement in transatlantic slavery, but specifically wanted to see the exhibition. So I knew something of Colston, but of course, coming to Bristol, I spoke to people who said, "Oh, have you seen his statue down in the city?" Which, of course, I hadn't, not living in Bristol. So at that time, I went to look at the statue, but through a series of events, I later then came to work in Bristol later that year. So that gave me the opportunity to want to research more about how was this statue of this man in, to me, the city centre in the year 2000. By the time I arrived, just before the beginning of the year 2000, by the year in the year 2000. So that's how I first got to be, yes, more, I think, surprised that this statue was still up. Although I did know, needless to say, because of the plaque, that it was erected because of his so-called philanthropy. What wasn't there was how the money used for the philanthropy, what was the source of his wealth. So I knew that, but it was nowhere on the plaque or the statue. So again, it was more about wanting to know about this statue itself. I knew more about the man, but I just didn't understand why this statue was still around.
So who is that man? Who does the statue represent? What did this person do in history? And how did you learn about that?
I learned more about him when I actually physically came to live and work in Bristol. So Edward Colston to me was somebody who I knew had been a member of the Royal African Company. I didn't at that time know how important a role he was in that company, but I did know that he was involved in trading in enslaved Africans. When I came to Bristol, I was looking for more information about him, having read, of course, more about, quote, him being this philanthropist in the city. So it was reading more about him, joining Bristol Radical History Group. I met through, well, it was basically a talk that was arranged by Madge Dresser. She wasn't actually the speaker, but she arranged it. So I met Madge Dresser, who, of course, I knew had been part of the exhibition that I'd come to. So through meeting different people who gave me more recommendations about where I could read more about him, was how I got to know more, which also then, even more puzzling, why there wasn't this side of his life, this narrative, known so much, whereas this statue was there saying, oh, this pious, virtuous man, when clearly there was another story that wasn't even put by the side of the statue.
So you mentioned that you read a number of items and that you joined a society, Bristol Radical History group. Could you tell me what items do you remember reading at the time, and what led you to join Bristol Radical History?
Well, I mentioned to you about my interest in history, and I know it's not used so much at the moment, but it was more about my interest in the fact that this group were looking about ordinary people researching and history from below about the agency of people that, quote, in your terms, were underrepresented in the narratives about particular events or particular people, and the fact that there were individual people that were engaged in certain research around Bristol and its history, and the fact that the group were trying to say there is more narratives about the history of Bristol than are commonly told, known about, or if they're raised, people, there's almost like a backlash to trying to say, look, there is a wider narrative, in this case, about Colston. So that was my interest. And then, of course, got involved in what were basically various events around abolition, the bicentenary events for 2007, where again, trying to raise a wider narrative, especially as, of course, abolition had tended to focus on the white people like Wilberforce rather than the enslaved themselves or the black abolitionists.
Now, what do you and what do others whom you are in association with feel about this statue?
I started by saying to you I was puzzled why this statue was still there, because it seemed to me it was almost hypocritical, because there the statue stood saying how virtuous he was and this philanthropy, which once I started reading actually wasn't that great compared to some of the other people in the city. So that was part of my feeling, almost it was like an affront, and also the fact that there was an absence of any acknowledgement of the enslaved Africans and their agency and what had happened. And talking with other people, I learned that yes, there was very mixed views in the city towards the statue. Some feeling it should come down, some feeling there should be a narrative that was added around the statue, and got more involved in hearing people say, well, we need to be raising the voices of people who are questioning why this statue is still there. I was aware too that I suppose I have a view about statues anyway. So I'm not a particular fan of statues of an individual person per se. So
why not?
Because I think there are issues about the fact that very few events are just about one person. And so to me, it smacks again of this, great man theory of history, that it's just this one person. But also, as I said, the fact that this particular person had a very, very different story, narrative that wasn't being told, that wasn't being acknowledged, or if it was getting reaction from some people that said, oh, well, remember his philanthropy, and don't necessarily question the fact that the money came from his engagement in the transatlantic slave trade. And this was very much, I think, part of, in the Bristol Radical History Group, I didn't join countering Colston, but a number of my friends are in that additional group, as it were. So there were those of us within, and still are, Bristol Radical History Group, who felt that the statue, were questioning why this statue was still there. But I think the other thing was that clearly I did learn and took part in a number of attempts to actually either get additional information put by the statue if the statue wasn't to come down, or that, which is much more my focus, is on having something in relation to the enslaved Africans, if they were going to have anything, commemoration or memorial should be more about them and Bristol's role in the slave trade.
To what extent would you be comfortable with a statue of either of someone who was enslaved or of someone racialized as black, like the statue of Mary Seacole in London, for instance?
Well, again, I wouldn't and don't advocate an individual enslaved African. So I don't know if you've seen the statue, the sculpture in Ooster Park in Amsterdam. Have you?
No.
Oh, right. Well, that to me is much more, and I've said that amongst the group, that to me, if we are going to have something memorialized or commemorated, would be much more, I would be in favor, because it's not just one enslaved African, it's a number of enslaved Africans. And basically, it was a grassroots organization that got that statue, that sculpture, I would call it much more a sculpture, put up.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned to you at the start how I had discovered with my family history that, in fact, I should have been reading much more about the Dutch transatlantic slave trade than the British one. So, again, I don't know if you're aware, but every July there is this ceremony called Ketakoti in Amsterdam, where wreaths are taken to this sculpture. There's actual ceremony and libation every July. So to me, that would be more what I would hope to see if it was decided that it had to be a sculpture or a statue, not an individual.
Thank you. What have you been trying to do in relation to the statue of Edward Colston? What organizations or groups have you created or been associated with? What is or was your ultimate goal?
Well, through Bristol Radical History Group, as I said, various efforts have been made in approaching the council about, and it's not just that group, there have been other people about, as I said, either having an additional narrative put by the statue, or that the statue is removed and put in the M shed or somewhere where a fuller narrative is put. This involvement was before it was toppled in June 2020. I also had been invited to a number of things that the council had organised about looking at how does Bristol commemorate its involvement or memorialise its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So there've been a number of meetings, not just me, but other people gone to at the M shed. But I'm afraid there's been lots of discussion over the years, but no actual outcome, in the sense that, well, you may or may not know, there have been about 3 versions of what the narrative should be originally put by the statue that never ever got done.
And who wrote those narratives? Those alternative plans?
The last one was Madge. I don't think she was alone. I think there were others. But a number of, quote, academic historians were asked to write a fuller narrative that was going to go by the statue.
What role did Bristol Radical History Group play in the writing of those alternative narratives?
They weren't. That was the point. That was the point.
Oh.
historical history academics were asked to.
Okay.
It wasn't something that went out to the community to be involved with or any particular group.
So when Bristol Radical History Group has been involved in contestation of the statue of Edward Colston, what routes to contesting it has the group taken?
Well, as I said, they've taken part in making suggestions or recommendations as to what should happen in relation to the statue that did mean about a narrative. We made some comment about the suggested narratives because some of them still did not give the full story or narrative of him. So again, it was very much an edited version. But
what aspect of the narrative?
And I guess one of the other issues is the backlash regarding the Society of Merchant Venturers about attempts to change or bring more to the fore a fuller narrative. And so Roger and Mark, as members of Countering Colston, would be able to say much more because they are members of Bristol Radical History Group. But as I said, Countering Colston itself was much more active in hence its name, challenging the name of Colston, not just the statue. And obviously your interest is around the statue.
What past events or which people of the past are you trying to remember, and why?
In relation to Colston's statue, I've said to you the enslaved Africans. And so I'm much more involved in trying to get interpretation centre, whatever, something in the city that tells that full story. And we don't even have a number of Bristol ships went to the Caribbean where there were revolts against the slave trade and life on the plantations. But again, we have nothing in the city to recognise or commemorate that. So I guess this is a bit about what. So I would like to see much more. Like the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool does at least give a bigger picture and commemorates more than just a few individuals around transatlantic slavery.
And in your work towards a memorial for the enslaved, or even a museum in Bristol, what have been the barriers that you face, and what have been the successes?
Well, it's ongoing in the sense that a number of sites, derelict buildings have been identified, but all of which somehow the council have not agreed for them to be the sites for such an interpretation centre. And so The latest was even this year, when the mayor felt that, quote, we weren't ambitious enough or whatever in what the plans were, and yet still we have nothing from the council in terms of what they are doing, which is why I said to you about the meetings held about the legacy. A number of us, not just in Bristol Radical History Group, but in those involved with cargo, other people interested in doing something, were hopeful something would happen, but still the talk goes on.
When you say the legacy, do you mean the legacy steering group?
Yes.
So could you tell me a little about the legacy steering group? What was it? And also the We Are Bristol History Commission. What was that? What are the similarities and differences between the two?
Yes, you're quite correct. Well, originally I mentioned to you I went to meetings. I was invited to meetings at the M Shed that were to do with the legacy, looking at what the legacy should be. So we were a wider group then, and those were chaired by Olivette. Then, I mean, they were, it was the council setting up the meetings, but she chaired those meetings. Out of that series of meetings, where various discussions went on and proposals went on as to how Bristol should commemorate or memorialise its involvement in transatlantic slavery, a steering committee was formed, and thereby I draw a blank, because a number of us who might well have been members of the committee somehow didn't become members of this committee. So what happened then in terms of the legacy steering group committee, or whatever it was called, how it then transmogrified into We Are History Commission.
Oh, I think they're two different things, but
they're different things, because what started as the legacy of Bristol's and moved into being, oh, Bristol's got a wider history we need to remember.
Oh, okay.
So its task originally was to look at Colston and transatlantic slavery, but its task was a wider task in the sense of the history of Bristol. And so there were issues then. Tim Cole became the chair of that commission. So again, the council's decision to move from one to the other, I can't quite comment, because I don't know how the legacy steering group then became this wider group, but it did. And then there were more questions about the fact that the composition of the commission were mainly history academics rather than a wider group of people representing different, perhaps, perspectives of what should happen in Bristol. And as I see the legacy of Bristol's involvement, Colston's statue, of course, was one of the issues, because that clearly was part of that, looking at that legacy, because at that point that statue was still there without an additional narrative to it. And still, as I said, things were not happening. So in a way, so the commission, and again, our group, Bristol Radical History Group, has tried to find out more about, well, what's happening, what's coming out of the commission? Because at the moment, so far, it's not clear. And what's not clear is, as you probably gather, about the statue having come down or been toppled, was, although the consultation was held about asking, quote, citizens of Bristol what do they think should happen to the statue, which was the purpose of the consultation, and having the statue in the M shed, it took quite a while to find out the outcome of the consultation, but my understanding is that the consultation, the majority were in favour of the statue remaining in the M shed, with a wider narrative being added to it. I don't know
what contribution did you make in response to the survey?
I said I thought it should remain in the museum and have a wider narrative to the statue, given that A, it was erected long after his death, B, that why was he chosen in the sense of having a statue when there were other philanthropists in the city without the history of being involved in the transatlantic slave trade. So there are a number of things for me about that statue.
Did you also contribute to a different project called Project Truth?
I didn't, but I am aware of people who were members of that. Well, I presume still are, in the sense of part of decolonising the museum. Is that what you mean?
Project Truth was a project that was worked on as a result of the Legacy Steering Group. Who might have been involved in that then, to your knowledge?
At the time, I was doing a master's history degree where I did a module around transatlantic slavery in the mainly in the Americas. And one of the final year undergraduate students was in that participant in that module as well. As I sent him quite a lot of information during and after we were doing that module, he later told me he'd become involved in that because his interest, as I said, was around the decolonisation of museums.
Okay. If it would be appropriate, please do suggest to the person that if they would like to speak with the project would be more than happy to speak with them. This is my final question. And if after I've asked this question, you feel that there are things that my questions haven't invited you to say, and you'd like to put them on record, please do mention them. So the statue was toppled, the statue of Edward Colston was toppled during a Black Lives Matter protest.
Yes.
What specifically Black voices have been raised in contestation against this statue and were raised in contestation against the statue during the Black Lives Matter protest? And to what extent, in your opinion, have Black voices in contestation of the statue been listened to?
I'll ask you to repeat it, Nathaniel, just to check that I've understood it? Interesting thing to me was that the Black Lives Matter movement and march in Bristol obviously involved lots of people, black and white. I actually was not physically here at the time. I was actually, because of COVID, I was up with my friends and remained there for some time. But I think my surprise was that it was white people that toppled the statue. So my interest was in asking other black friends who I knew had views about this statue, including ranging from add to the narrative or take it down. You know, what did they think about it? So I think most people said, glad he's gone, which is a bit like the mug, you know, glad he's been toppled. But more about how are we still, as black people, able to influence what had been a contested statue for yonks. Your point, contesting statues is not new. But one of the issues, certainly from black friends that I've spoken to, is the focus being on the enslaved Africans. So there are issues because of the legacy around lack of, how can I put it, lack of recognition, lack of memorializing people who themselves had agency and tried to do something. So it was not that they were passive victims, they were actively involved in the struggling. So their view was, okay, it's, you know, we've had years of trying to contest having this statue there as it was, but really it's the big thing about toppling it was more people asked about who this man was that probably knew nothing about Colston's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So in that way, that mere act, it was part of Black Lives Matter, but it triggered much more interest, discussion around the statue and who was this man, you know, why was this statue toppled? So I guess really, you know, people were of the view, well, we spent so long not having our voices listened to in terms of what should happen to the statue, and yet as part of this movement it's toppled, but it did raise the discussion, the conversations and things that perhaps much more than all the approaches had ever done.
Silu, Pascoe, thank you very much for sharing with me your perspective on the statue of Edward Colston.
Thank you, Nathaniel. If I think of anything else, I'll let you know.
Greatly appreciated.
And I will, I won't name him because, as I said, I will approach him if he's still in the city.
Oh.
About Project Truth. I'll tell him
much
about
obliged. It. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a lovely evening now, Silu.
And thank you. Bye.
Bye.